So how to eat the American elephant, the progressives' rejection of the American founding. Statism is the general term we could use to describe a secular view of government and the economy. It began when Adam and Eve disobeyed God, desiring to determine for themselves what was good and evil. If you read Genesis chapter 3, you would find out the whole story. The Tower of Babel was probably the first public expression of statism or socialism, with corporate man seeking to be his own God. That also, the detail is in Genesis chapter 11. You can read about it and compare with where we are today and think about it's probably the same thing back then. Ancient Israelites demanded their own king to rule them in place of God, so they could be just like other nations, a blatant rejection of God. America's founding was the first time in humanity that the law of our Creator was the foundation of the Constitution, declaring human rights from God, not man or even the Constitution itself. America's early leaders are mostly Christians. They weren't all saints, of course, and did sin, like all men, but their heart was to obey God. American framers recognized that humans are created equal and endowed by the Creator with inalienable rights of life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, religious freedom, and property, and that God is the only superpower, supreme superpower, and government is designed only to protect those rights against domestic and foreign predators, and that government should leave people alone on issues not specified in the Constitution, and that separation of powers is critical. Government is not to be weak, but to be carefully checked. The founders also warned against utopian thinking about human nature. And the last time they checked before giving the Constitution to the children of America, human nature was still sinful and has not been making progress throughout history. Today and throughout the short 245 years of American history, some of our leaders not only have a much different heart and mind, which lead them to shape a different America from the founders' blueprint, but also gave rise of secularism in the government, from which the devil was glad to take a sizable bite in the process of eating up the American elephant in order to weaken people's self-governing power by increasing centralized government control and to replace God. The progressives consider that human is not born free. Freedom is a product of human making throughout history, which is changing in the direction of increasing human freedom. As our society grew and become better, the government's role would evolve with it. Evolving law and the sovereignty of the state replaced the absolutes of God's law. Roscoe Pound, who was the president of Harvard Law School in the 1920s, said that the state takes the place of Jehovah. We have a few presidents since the 1900s happened to side with the progressives. President Woodrow Wilson stood out among them. Woodrow Wilson was born in 1856 in Virginia. He was a history and political science student at Johns Hopkins University, which emphasized in bringing the German-Prussian education to the U.S. We have talked about how the Prussian education and the idea of children belong to the state shaped the U.S. public school system via the American progressives in the mid to late 1800s last time. So now we're talking about Woodrow Wilson's the impact in him that brought that concept to the policy, his presidential policy. Woodrow Wilson became a prolific progressive scholar around 1912 when the Democrats were interested in recruiting progressive candidates to run for offices. He was open and direct in criticizing the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. Wilson pledged to be an unconstitutional governor when he was governor of the state of New Jersey. He criticized the Declaration of Independence written by Thomas Jefferson was only to solve the problem in 1776. Interestingly enough, Abraham Lincoln also commented on Jefferson regarding the Declaration of Independence with an opposite stroke. He said, all honor to Jefferson, to the men who, in the concrete pressure of a struggle for national dependence by a single people, had the coolness, forecast, and capacity to introduce into a merely revolutionary document a abstract truth applicable to all men and all times. Wilson also critiqued the Constitution deeply and intensely. He preferred the British parliamentary tradition, with no separation of legislative and administrative power, which appeared to be flexible and without limit to him. In his book, The New Freedom, he stated that the government is not a machine, not a living thing, but a living thing. It falls not under the theory of the universe, but under the theory of organic life. It is accountable to Darwin, not to Newton. It is modified by its environment, necessitated by its tasks, shaped to its function by the sheer pressure of life. No living things can have its organs offset against each other as checks and live. It is not hard to imagine President Wilson frustration with the slow checks and balances movement of the United States government mechanism while sitting in his new Oval Office. Um, in his 1907 Author and the Signers, Wilson also said that we're not bound to adhere to the doctrines held by the signers of the Declaration of Independence. We are as free as they were to make and unmake governments. We're not here to worship men or a document. Actually, the founders used the Constitution to lay down the rules on how to play the government game. It does not have rules on how to worship the Constitution. Quite the contrary, it does come with rules on how to change it if the majority or supermajority of the congressional representatives so desire. There are 27 more rules, including the Bill of Rights, added to the Constitution, which are called the amendments. Instead of worshiping the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, the progressives actually secretly developed their own idols to worship, the experts. Contrary to the founders' first trust in God, and secondly, we the people, the progressives believes that in other progressives, selfless, public interest-oriented experts who are zealous advocates in solving problems. Um, if humans were angels, these trusted experts would be ideal government servants. Unfortunately, our founding fathers have used ancient and contemporary examples in warning the children of America against utopian thinking about human nature. Experts are not angels. They sin too. If men were angels, no government would be necessary, said James Madison. These seeds of trusting experts instead of common people gradually grew and blossomed in all branches of government. The executive branch started to create more bureaucracy filled with experts. The legislative bodies trust the experts' regulation instead of implementing people's will. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi's famous quote, pass the bill to find out what's in it, was a classic example of such experts know better mentality. We also see courts cases such as judges defer to the experts to solve problems instead of reviewing the evidence, applying the law, and coming up with solutions themselves. Seeds of trust in expertise encourages centralized government and endless social programs to thrive. We have quite a few presidents' socialist policies and programs to prove it. Theodore Roosevelt's New Nationalism, Woodrow Wilson's Federal Reserve System, Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal Social Security Program, Socialist State, Truman's Fair Deal, John F. Kennedy's New Frontier, Lyndon Johnson's The Great Society, War on Poverty, Nixon's Environmental Protection Agency, Jimmy Carter's Department of Education, Clinton's New Covenant, Obama's New Foundation turned fundamentally change America. From Teddy Roosevelt to Obama, our federal government has grown to be an employer of nearly 9.1 million workers, comprising nearly 6% of total employment in the United States. Our founding fathers were aware of the coercive power that most central governments had over their citizens. After studying history, they worried that a strong central government will become dictatorial and take away our freedoms and liberties. Our founding fathers in 1787 wrote the Constitution as the rules to limit the government, not to limit the people. The 10th Amendment says the powers not delegated to the federal government by the Constitution are reserved to the states, respectively, or to the people. James Madison wrote, the powers delegated by the Constitution to the federal government are few and defined. All other powers remain in state governments, and these powers are numerous and undefined. In the Constitution, the basic powers delegated to the federal government are to collect taxes and pay debts, to coin money, to regulate commerce, to establish immigration laws, to establish weights and measures, to establish post offices and roads, to raise armies and navies, to declare war, to provide patents and copyrights, to make rules for captures, criminals, and bankruptcies, to operate the District of Columbia, and nothing else. Jimmy Carter's Department of Education, Richard Nixon's Environmental Protection Agency, Franklin Roosevelt's Social Security Program, Lyndon Johnson's Medicare Medicaid program, Woodrow Wilson's Federal Reserve, along with so many other federal government agencies are, you guessed it, unconstitutional. The only thing that are constitutional for the government to do are those things specifically enumerated in the Constitution. Hence, if something is not listed there, it cannot do that something, period. That is the whole point of enumerated power. For more than 100 years, the Progressive Democrats, with the help of some Republicans, not only incrementally installed unconstitutional government agencies in the executive branch, but also soared the government expenditures, especially in the area outside of its jurisdiction. Non-defense spending was 57. In 1965, it was 80% on 2005. Social Security and Medicare Medicaid spending was 40% of the federal budget in 2005 and 53% in 2009. The tax burden has gradually increased on American people during the 20th century, but Americans can only be taxed so much. So the statist national government gets more money by borrowing it or creating money out of nothing. This is legalized robbery of the wealth of people who have labored hard and saved over their lifetime. Plus, it lays the burden upon future generations. Our current national debt is over 29 trillion. What does even 1 trillion look like? Here is what it looks like. You are the little guy on the left bottom corner. The concept of trillion dollars is so big that it's hard to even imagine what it looks like. So let's first break the number itself down to time. 1 trillion seconds is 317 centuries, and 9,193 centuries for 29 trillion. Or if you spend 1 million a day since Jesus was born, you would have not spent 1 trillion by now. The federal government owned 50% of the land in the western states, but only 3% in the northeastern states, where people settled earlier during the colonial time. Today, the federal government's excessive regulation on private property and land use seems to suggest that the colonial British government was more generous to its American subjects than the progressive American government to its citizens now. Did you notice that America has also become more and more socialist as the progressives progressed since the 1900s? Every socialist progressive politician has to promise more to give the people in order to be elected. The progressives rejected their rejection of the American founding is nothing but rejecting God's value being practiced in America. It paved the way for modern liberals and leftists to further deny the Constitution and claim to fundamentally change America. President Barack Obama's campaign slogan to fundamentally change America has merged into a clear and disturbing picture of eliminating traditional constitutional forms of justice, basic American government responsibility to we the people, and essential national security. Democrats have seriously discussed eliminating the Electoral College, a move which could mean that progressive run New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, and a few other major cities would essentially decide each and every presidential election. Some have even discussed eliminating the entire US Senate, a move which would ensure that a few large leftist states would forever dominate the entire nation. The concept of the rule of law is on the fundamentally change America chopping block. Progressive judges across the nation have replaced the concepts of adherence to precedent and statutes with their own personal beliefs. One of the most basic purposes of law, protecting citizens from criminal activities, has been challenged by the leftist move to empty out jails under any convenient excuses. From the beginning of the American founding, two powerful things were already set up against each other: the progressive politics and the Constitution. Progressives have been successful for 100 years in sneaking progressive socialist ideas into all branches of our constitutional republic. And we are watching live performance of all levels of tyrannical government, which our founders were trying to avoid when they gave us the Constitution in 1787. Despite of the progress the world has made since 1776, the Declaration of Independence stays the same. Calvin Coolidge, the 30th President of the United States, in his The Inspiration of the Declaration speech in 1926, explained the best. If all men are created equal, that is final. If they are endowed with inalienable rights, that is final. If governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed, that is final. No advance, no progress can be made beyond the propositions. To deny its truth and soundness, the only direction to progress historically is backwards. The progressive idea is not more modern than the founding fathers. The Declaration of Independence is the product of the spiritual insight of the people, inspired by the biblical values and truth. Science and material abundance did not create Declaration of Independence, but the Declaration of Independence created them. The things of the spiritual truth come first, and the world flourished under the blessing of the truth. The Constitution sets down principles for America. Constitutional rules are goals for us to work on. They are short and simple. Constitutional society is lean and strong, not fat and weak, like what we have today. American founders' approach is not dead. As long as people still believe in God, private property rights, self-reliance, importance of family, and willing to use armed forces to defend the nation, Americans still have hope to build a constitutional republic by people's determination in building their constitutional town, constitutional city, constitutional county, and constitutional state. Martin Treptow was a World War I soldier who was found killed on his mission with his diary, which Ronald Reagan quoted in his speech. America must win this war. Therefore, I will work, I will save, I will sacrifice, I will endure, I will fight cheerfully and do my utmost, as if the issue of the whole struggle depended on me alone. As nations around the world have again, since World War II, fell into the hands of progressive, tyrannical governments, Americans are facing a war of Martin Treptows that we must win. So help us God.